you have Tyreek Hill on your roster, I would consider trying to trade him. You might be selling a little bit low, but I'm worried that we haven't seen the Dolphins bottom out yet.
All right, everybody, welcome back. I am your party host, Joe Rivera, and along with me is my interesting colleague, Jacob Camenker. Jacob, we are 1 week into the NFL season, and you have a fantasy team. I know you got a couple, so how broken are your teams already?
At least one of them is pretty broken at this point. I had a lot of shares in Tank Bigsby this year too, and he got traded to the Eagles ahead of week 2. So I'm going to be pretty thin at running back in a lot of leagues, but I'm pretty confident that I've built my rosters well enough to still be contenders and try not to overreact to week 1. That's our number one goal when we cover the NFL, especially from a fantasy perspective, right, man?
Yeah, absolutely. Like the thing about week 1, and I say this all the time, Jacob, is that weird things happen, right? Like you can't trust anything you see in week 1. I mean, Justin Fields looks like a franchise quarterback. Daniel Jones looks like a franchise quarterback. Travis Etienne has a massive game, like after career game in week 1, right? So, to that end, we want to bring it in with a little segment we'd like to call Panic or Patience, right? So there's lots of guys who had, pretty good games, and there's guys who didn't have such good games. And we don't want to overreact, but we want to paint the picture a little bit to tell all of you playing fantasy at home whether you should be patient with some of these guys or whether you should have a little bit of panic. So, Jacob, I want to start him off with let's go down to Big D in Dallas. Dak Prescott and the Cowboys brought it down to the wire with the Eagles. What do you think about Dak Prescott? Is he a panic guy or a patience guy?
I'm willing to have patience with him. I know he only had single-digit fantasy points in week 1. He didn't get a touchdown, which is very frustrating for fantasy managers because you need your quarterback to play well to have a chance to win every week, especially in deep leagues. But Dak Prescott looked really good just to the eye test. He was victimized by a handful of CD Lamb drops, but his average depth of target was 9.97 yards per attempt. That was 6th best in the NFL. So he's going to be continuing to throw the ball downfield, and I'm confident the touchdowns are going to come for Dak. So I'm not worried about him. I thought the fact that he looked good against a very well-coached Eagles defense is a sign that he should have a good season. He just needs to get to the end zone and not have Javonte Williams get all of the team's touchdowns.
Yeah, no one likes a touchdown vulture, right? And I think the thing with Dak, and we've talked about this before, Jacob, is it's good that he has the familiarity with Brian Schottenheimer. With some coaches and some players who are going, going to new teams or going new offensive coordinators, new systems, there's that adjustment period, right? But a big part about Dak pairing with Brian Schottenheimer is his familiarity with this offense, which at this point, the Cowboys got to win, right? Micah Parsons or no Micah Parsons, you add George Pickens to the fold, they got to win. So for fantasy purposes, that should keep fantasy owners at ease as the season continues, right?
Absolutely. And you referenced it. Micah Parsons being gone is going to make Dallas's defense worse. That means that Dallas is going to have to win by outscoring their opponent. Now, granted, that's how all NFL teams have to win, but their defense is going to allow a lot of points. So Dallas might have to score 27, 30, 35 points every single week to win. That's going to give Prescott a lot of scoring opportunities. So I really like him still. I think his ceiling is very high. So I'm going to be patient with him here.
All right, so we go from the gambler and his Cowboys to Sin City and the Las Vegas Raiders, Jacob. And Ashton Jeanty, top 10 pick, a guy that we were talking about all offseason that Pete Carroll wants to make this guy the Raiders' identity, right? We know Pete Carroll loves to run the football. He loves tough-nosed football teams. But when you look at his results, stats from this weekend, 19 carries for 38 yards against the Patriots. He's getting the touches, which is a good thing, and fantasy owners should be happy about that. But let's talk about the results a little bit. Should we be looking at Ashton Jeanty with panic or patience?
Again, I'm going to go patience here. I understand that there will be, in some fantasy managers' eyes, they're going to look at this and say, I'm panicking a little bit because the Raiders' offensive line didn't look good. Anytime a back averages 2 yards per carry, it's not a very encouraging thing. But I would caution, people who have Jeanty on their roster to just understand that the Patriots under Mike Vrabel have a very well-coached defense. And their front line personnel with Milton Williams joining the fold is much better than it was last year. So they had a little bit more of an advantage against the Raiders O-line than I think people realized. And you referenced it. Jeanty still had a high volume of touches. He touched the ball 21 times during the game. There really isn't anyone who's going to take carries away from him. Raheem Mostert, I believe, was inactive for the game. So Genty's going to get a lion's share of the workload at running back. Eventually, things are going to work out for him. And I think one of the other things that's kind of underrated about Genty, he's changing his stance in the backfield as he comes into the NFL. He used to be like super upright during his college days, but now he's trying to do something a little more traditional. That might mess with him a little bit as he kind of gets into the flow there. So I think he's going to pick up the pace as the season goes along and maybe gets into some weaker matchups. So I'm going to be patient with him. He's a talented player.
I just want to touch on Brock Bowers real quick, Jacob. And how does Brock Bowers? We know that tight end and fantasy don't always mix well. We're looking at the three of Kittle, Bowers, and Trey McBride are the holy trinity of tight ends, right? Tom Vieira over on the NFL Connect team likes to call tight ends a fantasy wasteland. But how does Brock Bowers kind of factor into the equation there with the Raiders?
Yeah, I'm with Tom on tight end being a fantasy wasteland. Like there's 6 players I like at the position. The rest is kind of, you just gotta pick one and go with it. But in terms of how Brock Bowers impacts the Raiders, he's gonna be their top target. Geno Smith showed great chemistry with him. He's just a mismatch weapon. So as long as he's healthy and on the field, he is going to generate a ton of targets, a ton of receiving yards, and be one of their top red zone threats. So I'm very excited to see what he can do. Obviously banged up his knee in week 1, so if he's out, that is going to kind of render the Raiders offense, take them down a level, and see maybe they'll lean a little more on the running game. But Bowers is clear cut their top weapon there. And I say that as someone who loves Jacoby Myers and thinks he's a really good player. But Bowers is critical in having that offense play at the level they did against the Patriots.
All right, Jacob. So we go from Sin City to South Beach, and it's anything but sunny skies in Miami this week after the Dolphins were trounced by Daniel Jones and the Colts in week 1. And one of the biggest storylines this whole offseason was Tyreek Hill and Tua Tagovailoa and their chemistry. But let's look specifically at Tyreek Hill and a guy that didn't have a great game, along with the rest of the Dolphins offense. Are we looking at Tyreek as a panic or patience guy?
Yeah, I'm going to sound the panic alarm on Tyreek Hill. I'm a little worried about him. I just look at that Dolphins team and I say to myself, man, that thing could fall apart quickly. I mean, Mike McDaniel entered the year on the hot seat. General manager Chris Greer, I believe, is probably on the hot seat as well. So, if this team falls out of contention, all of a sudden they're going to be maybe considering trading some of their pieces. And Tyreek Hill, according to reports, is generating interest in trade calls. The Dolphins have kind of rebuffed that to this point. But, if they fall out of contention, he might get moved. And I know a lot of people will say to themselves, hey, couldn't that land him in a better situation? Sure, but changing teams mid-season can be problematic. And then if he doesn't get traded, you're looking at this team that isn't performing well. Tyreek Hill has rarely been on teams that don't make the playoffs. I believe last year was the first year he missed it. So he could end up, becoming more and more frustrated. We already saw him animated on the sidelines against the Colts. So this whole situation just screams to me of something that I don't really want to deal with. So if you have Tyreek Hill on your roster, I would consider trying to trade him. You might be selling a little bit low, but I'm worried that we haven't seen the Dolphins bottom out yet. So it's more of a concern about the team than the player here, because I still think Hill has something to give, but I'm very low on the Dolphins right now.
So, Jake, I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you had to say the top 3 destinations for Tyreek Hill and a potential trade, who makes the most sense, you think?
Well, I think you look at his former team, the Kansas City Chiefs, with the injuries they've had at receiver. Rashee Rice is suspended. Xavier Worthy's dealing with the shoulder injury. They could use a talent like him. I think you look at the 49ers, another team that's really banged up at receiver without Brandon Ayuk. Juwan Jennings is hurt, and George Kittle has that hamstring injury that's keeping him out for 4 weeks. So they could maybe dip into the trade market for him. And then I'd say the Washington Commanders are kind of a sneaky team to watch. They have Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel, and so they have a pretty good 2-man rotation there. But if you had Tyreek Hill to that, all of a sudden Jaden Daniels is looking like he has an elite receiving core. So those would be the 3 teams I would look at, if Tyreek Hill were to get moved.
And when you think about it, those are all, 3 pretty solid quarterbacks you want to have throwing the ball to him, right? I mean, between Brock Purdy, we know he's banged up a little bit, but Brock Purdy, Jaden Daniels, or a reunion with Patrick Mahomes, that sounds like heaven to a fantasy owner's ears. So, Jacob, let's move on from sunny South Beach to chilly Minnesota. And as mentioned, Tom Vieira likes to call tight ends a fantasy wasteland, but I personally believe, and I think you'd agree with me, a good tight end is a wonderful security blanket for a young quarterback. In this case, J.J. McCarthy and T.J. Hockenson, right? Just 4 targets in the Vikings week 1 matchup versus the Chicago Bears. What do you think is the outlook there? Is TJ Hockenson a panic or patience guy?
He's a clear-cut patience guy. I think, like, if you're looking at guys that I want to trust that maybe didn't have great week ones, Hawkinson's very high on the list because the first 3 quarters of that game, JJ McCarthy looked terrible. It looked like he wasn't ready to start. It looked like, hey, the Vikings might have made a mistake in letting Sam Darnold go. You know, all the typical overreactions that come with a bad week 1 performance. But JJ McCarthy turned things on in the fourth quarter. He led the team on 3 consecutive touchdown drives, come from behind wins. So I think as he gets more comfortable, he's going to be able to distribute the ball better to his weapons. That's going to include Hawkinson. It's going to take them a little bit of time to, develop chemistry and build a rapport. But I still think that I'm willing to trust Hawkinson. It might just take a couple weeks before he's performing at the level of, a top 6 tight end, which is where he was drafted this year.
So I have a question for you, Jacob. With obviously McCarthy's a young guy, but with young quarterbacks, there might be a little bit of pressure to feed the ball to your superstar wide receiver, right? And Justin Jefferson is out there. Obviously, Jordan Addison suspended, but he'll be back at some point. So where do you think Hockenson kind of fits into the equation at that point? If you could give a little bit of projection or a guess about how Hockenson will fit in when this team is at full strength.
Yeah, I think when the Vikings are at full strength, I would say that Hawkinson's probably their number 3 target. Jefferson being the clear cut number 1, and Addison looked really good in his action last year. Like you said, he's suspended the first 3 games of the season, so it's going to take him time. But once he's on the field, that will kind of be his role as the number 2 guy, the complement to Jefferson. But I actually think having both receivers will help Hawkinson because opposing defenses are going to have to focus on containing those guys and not letting them beat them, you know, far down the field for big touchdowns and big plays. Hawkinson will then have more space in the middle of the field. I feel like when it's just Jefferson out there and, the kind of stable of other weapons they have, teams are more able to focus on Hawkinson as that number 2 guy. So that could have also led to his kind of, I don't want to call it lackluster, but below average week 1.
All right, Jacob, let's go down to the Steel City now. And we're looking at the Steelers running back room. Jalen Warren, but let's look at Caleb Johnson here, right? 1 attempt, -2 yards on the week. Obviously not a presentable performance. What do you think about Caleb Johnson, and is he a panic or patience guy?
Yeah, I'm panicking on this, and it's because we've seen this movie before with Arthur Smith. For whatever reason, Arthur Smith loves to, trust guys who, you would think are below other players on the depth chart. We've seen it with Jonnu Smith behind Kyle Pitts in Atlanta. Last season, we saw it with Cordero Patterson getting a ton of work despite Najee Harris and Jalen Warren's presence in Pittsburgh's offense. And now we're kind of seeing this highly drafted running back who everyone kind of thought, hey, this guy's going to eventually be the leader. And he's working behind Jalen Warren, which makes some sense. But then Kenneth Gainwell, who they signed from the Eagles in the offseason, but got a pretty significant share of the workload. So I'm just looking at that and saying, if Johnson's getting 1 carry and he didn't do much on it, it's going to take him a long time to win Arthur Smith's trust. So I understand wanting to give him another week or 2, but if he continues to have this kind of workload trend where he's just barely being used, I think you got to just cut bait with him and say, this is an unfortunate situation, and maybe later in the year he'll be more part of the rotation. But Arthur Smith just loves to trust his backups and not as much the young talent. So I'm panicking a little bit about this one, probably more than any other, highly drafted running back for fantasy purposes.
Well, Jacob, you talk about Arthur Smith, but the guy, I think we know who's really running the show out there on the offense in Pittsburgh is Aaron Rodgers, right? And so how do you think Aaron Rodgers kind of factors into the offense there, and what does that mean for fantasy owners potentially?
Yeah, I think Aaron Rodgers obviously is in control of that offense. And, we've seen it in the past. When he likes the way a guy's playing, they're going to get that guy into the lineup more because he trusts them. I don't know if that's the situation with Caleb Johnson, if Aaron Rodgers just loves Kenneth Gainwell and that's why he's in. I don't know if that's the situation, but if Rodgers builds a good rapport with Jalen Warren as a receiver out of the backfield or with Kenneth Gainwell as a receiver or in pass protection, then that could make it even harder for Caleb Johnson to kind of break into the rotation. And we'll see that with the weapons outside of DK Metcalf as well. Rodgers looked like he liked throwing to Calvin Austin Jr., so he'll probably continue to, get time on the field there, and that'll that'll just continue to be what happens. If Aaron Rodgers likes you, you're going to be on the field and you're going to play.